even after going to grad school in China, and I'd say I'm about as close to native level in Chinese as I could get as a non-native speaker.
What's up everyone, this is Rita, aka 范老师, your accent coach and Chinese teacher. Today we are breaking down another big YouTuber's Mandarin Chinese. Oriental Pearl films videos speaking to people in Mandarin Chinese and Japanese out on the streets. We're gonna dive in to see how native she sounds, what she does well, and what we can learn from her. I'm also gonna talk a bit about how to communicate with Chinese natives and how to start a conversation with strangers, which can be pretty tough for people who are a bit shy. So make sure you watch till the end and subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell too, so don't miss out on any Mandarin learning tips that you won't find anywhere else. 3、2、1，订阅了吗？ Let's get started. Oriental Pearl, or An Ming, is an American girl who studied learning Chinese in college. I looked through her Chinese videos and found one of her sitting in front of camera, speaking long paragraphs in Mandarin, which could be representative of her real language ability instead of quote-unquote the basic Chinese used when talking with strangers out on the street. Let's see what she can do.
我学习中文的时候很刻苦，每天坚持学习6个小时，每天要背大量生词。3年后就过了汉语水平考试6级。
So my first impression of her Chinese is that it's actually quite advanced. Probably has learned a bunch of vocabulary, spent a decent time on tones, but let's start out with something that a ton of people mess up. Her overall intonation sounds pretty good. But if we listen to her 我学习
中文的时候
the 我 actually came out more like a first tone, 我学习, which is a really common mistake among learners, especially at the start of the sentence where they're trying to stress when I was studying Chinese, like they would in English. This also messes up the subsequent 学习, which should be second tone, 学习。
我学习中文的时候很刻苦。
我学习中文的时候很刻苦。
每天坚持学习6个小时。
The tones of her 坚持 were a bit off, but we'll talk about that a bit later. And her 水平的水 was really high.
过了汉语水平考试6级。
So it sounds more like the first tone, 水平. The second tone should be a bit fuller, 水平. And actually a quick comment on the HSK. The biggest language level assessment for Chinese learners. What does passing HSK 6 mean? To be honest, I've met and seen quite a few students, particularly Koreans who are planning to study in China, pass the HSK 6 in 2 years or less. However, that doesn't actually imply being at this level, especially with speaking and listening, but rather their ability to pass the test. I could go on about the test for days, or maybe make a whole video talking about it. In short, it's a pretty crappy exam, at least before they launch the new edition, which I'll definitely take a look at. Basically, it tests you more on your reading level than anything else. But if you don't have any other options, I suppose it is a systematic way to gauge your progress in Mandarin.
在美国读初中和高中的时候，我学了5年西班牙语，但是失败了。当时我天真的以为只要每天去上课就能学会西班牙语，但是我错了。我上课不认真听讲，经常走神，不怎么做作业啊，不背单词。5年后我还是不会西班牙语。
Again, in general, she actually has a pretty solid grasp of tones. But when it comes to combinations of the third tone and the second tone, there's still a bit of room for improvement. In this section, she used a bunch of different words with this combination. But she said, 美国我学了5年 Regardless, the third second tone combination always poses challenges for learners. So I recommend spending a lot of time on common words and phrases with this. 语言以前 50 Actually, on that note, her 走神, which is also a third second combo, sounded really good.
经常走神。
But moving on, let's look at this right here.
我上课不认真听讲，不背单词，不会西班牙语。
Do you know what the issue was here? Pretty early on your Chinese learning journey, you probably learned that when the word no or not, i.e. 不 is followed by another character with a fourth tone, it becomes a second tone. 不认真听讲，不背单词，不会西班牙语。I'm a little surprised she makes this mistake, given how high her level is, but it happened. And we use phrases like 不要、不是 so often that if you get them wrong, it'll be pretty jarring. So make sure to practice.
不怎么做作业啊，不背单词。
Quick note, one thing she did super well here is her use of interjections, which we call 语气词。不怎么做作业啊。This specific case right here is when we are listening of a bunch of things. You might say 什么什么啊，我这1年多没去什么地方，就是在家上课啊，拍视频啊，看书啊什么的。那家中国超市东西超全，老干妈呀、火锅底料啊、螺蛳粉啊，什么都有。评论啊、点赞啊、转发啊，都是对范老师最大的支持。Different interjections like 啊、嘛、吧、呢 are used so frequently in Mandarin that knowing when to throw one in will really help you sound more natural and 地道。Now, according to what she said in her YouTube videos, she's been learning and using Chinese for 8 years. That's definitely a long time. But to be honest, the longer I teach languages, the less it means to me when people say, I've been learning X language for Y years. Some people study 5 minutes a day, and some people, like Oriental Pearl, may have studied for 6 hours a day. The total dozens or hundreds or even thousands of hours that you put into the learning process is what really matters. Quality of study matters too, but we'll save that for another video on highly effective study methods.
我原本就对中文这门语言很感兴趣，觉得中文很好听，而且很喜欢汉字。
汉字原本 is a fairly formal advanced word, and she used it really well here. Even though it's a pre-written paragraph, or at least she had pre-written points, it does speak to her general ability in the language, which I would say appears to be much more better and much more advanced than some other YouTubers who make similar videos. Something to pay attention to with regard to pronunciation though, is that 原本 is a second third combination. She kind of pronounced it as 原本，我原本。
我原本
This is probably just because she's thinking and there's a natural pause there, but she drew it out and the pronunciation got thrown off a bit. A native speaker would potentially draw it out there as well while they're thinking, but they will still maintain the proper tone. 我原本就对中文这门语言很感兴趣。
我原本就对中文这门语言很感兴趣。
Actually, one thing I noticed is that her GCC pronunciation is a bit unstable. Her GCC sounds are great when followed by an E, but when followed by an U sound, they sound a bit more like 猪出书。兴趣
很感兴趣。
兴趣工具
工具
我没去
我没去。
When you pronounce 居区虚
Wait a minute. Who are you?
The tip of the tongue is right behind your bottom teeth, and it's the middle of your tongue runs up like an arch to get that 居区虚 sound. Go back and practice those to make sure you get them right. And if you see anywhere telling you that GCC and 知知诗 are similar, throw away the book and don't listen to anything they have to say. I do have to bring this up. Many Chinese learners make this mistake, and it can be a bit confusing. Chinese characters are 汉字 with a fourth tone, but I've heard and seen so many Chinese learners pronounce it or type it as 汉字 with a neutral tone, which means guys, men. So saying 很喜欢汉字 actually means I really like guys. There's obviously nothing wrong with that, but just make sure you are saying what you really mean.
每天多听、多看、多说、多写，让自己沉浸在中文当中，才能获得语感。学中文并不容易，但是我对你有信心。
Let's listen to that first part. 每天多听、多看、多说、多写。
多听、多看、多说、多写。
In addition to the third-second tone combo we mentioned before, the first tone versus the fourth tone are probably the other most common tone mistakes that people make when speaking. So that's another thing I really recommend drilling. Especially her first tones might be getting a bit thrown off by the fact that she wants to stress speak more, 多说, or write more, 多写. And this is a huge difference between Chinese and English in terms of stress in pronunciation. 每天多听多看多说多写. Even with all these little mistakes I just pointed out, I do think her Chinese is very good. She's obviously put a lot of time into everything. And I think we share similar language learning philosophies, especially in her discussion with Matt versus Japan. Maybe because she is a language teacher too. Also, like I said, here are some tips to start a conversation with Chinese natives. Oriental Pearl says so herself that she used to be very shy, and she was able to overcome that by forcing herself out of her comfort zone. Things to pay attention to when you want to practice a language are the common greetings that people use.
你好，请问一下，这里有山楂吗？你有什么推荐呢？什么比较好吃？我喜欢吃中国菜。还记得我吗？麻婆豆腐，地道的吗？好吃吗？
Also, asking questions is a really important part of communication. And as a language teacher, I always push people to not ask yes or no questions, but rather open-ended questions with who, what, where, when, why in Chinese. Like, 他是谁？这是什么？你老家是哪儿的？你们什么时候关门？你们为什么不喜欢绿色的帽子？ So it could be stuff like asking where they are from, where they live, etc.
你是中国哪儿的呢？南方的吗？上海。你是中国哪儿的呢？
吉林东北。
吉林东北，我的天哪，我太喜欢东北人，我的妈呀！
As such, you'll probably be answering those types of questions as well.
我以前在哈尔滨，我搬到北京，然后搬到上海，我住在杨浦区，我住在上海。其实我地址是在上海，但是现在外国人不能回中国，我就只好待在这儿。
And on that note, your experience is one thing that will always come up. 你在哪儿学的中文？你学中文多久了？
中文是在哪里学的？
我中文是在中国学的。
那你自己本国是哪一国的？
我，你觉得呢？其实我是美国人。
美国人啊。
对。
And I've actually seen a lot of people online mention that she likes to name drop that she went to Fudan University.
我是过来读书的，我在那个早稻田大学读书，我是交换生，我是复旦大学派过来的。我在复旦读书，在复旦读书。
真的啊？
对。
她喜欢用名校给自己贴金。But actually, I watched a bunch of her videos and didn't really get that feeling. It's a university that almost everyone knows, and it's a great icebreaker in starting a conversation with someone, especially if they are from Shanghai or even went to the same school. And technically, whatever answer you give to 你在哪儿学的中文 will probably have follow-up questions. But her mentioning 复旦大学 seems pretty acceptable to me. She also uses quite a bit of slang like 吓死宝宝了，热死宝宝了，
热死宝宝了。
which shows that she probably consumes a lot of Chinese language media or interacts a lot with natives. In my opinion, she sounds really good in Chinese. I wouldn't go as far to call her a native speaker, as there are multiple aspects that she could still improve. But she's very confident and comfortable in using the language, and it shows. Besides the tone combinations that I mentioned that she seems to struggle with, I think another thing that she could work on is her general intonation. Like other non-native speakers, she tends to pronounce every syllable very clearly, especially in this video where she might be reading a script. Her speech sounds a bit more staccato rather than the more fluid speech of a native. When she's out on the streets, though, it does sound much more natural. Just like when I watch my own videos sitting here speaking to the camera, I feel like my English doesn't sound as fluid as when I'm having a casual conversation about topics that I've discussed a million times. Straight out of the dictionary. Now, I'm not saying you should slur your words together or not to enunciate, but this is a pretty big differentiating factor between natives and non-natives. I've been posting listening quizzes on my Instagram stories for over a year now, and some followers said they could understand other non-native accounts' listening quizzes very easily, but found my quizzes harder. This is probably because I try my hardest to speak in the normal way that you will actually hear, rather than in the hyper-enunciated 老师腔, or teach pronunciation that sounds like it's straight out of the dictionary. Head over to my Instagram to see for yourself. At the end of the day, arming yourself with questions to use, familiarizing yourself with tones, or using all the native slang, or just among many things that will make you much more confident with speaking to natives. Practice as much as you can so you feel comfortable using them in a new situation. But know that even if you make mistakes, people will appreciate the fact that you are learning Chinese. And don't stress too much. If you enjoyed the video, hit like and subscribe if you want to learn more Chinese with me. Remember, with 范老师, Chinese makes perfect sense. See you in the next video.